Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar about the SolarWinds incident of this week. My name is Elise Manna-Browne. I'm Director of Threat Operations with Novacoast, and I just want to explain what's going on with SolarWinds and their Orion servers and what you can do about it. It came to be publicly known that SolarWinds was compromised by some advanced attackers. A lot of organizations are attributing this to Russia. Attributions definitely an art, not a science, but we certainly know that these were sophisticated attackers that targeted SolarWinds specifically in order to perpetuate attacks against other organizations, including SolarWinds customers. This resulted in malicious code being added to a legitimate dynamic link library, DLL, that's part of the Orion software entirely. So what was happening is SolarWinds customers were running updates for their Orion servers, and those legitimate update servers actually had the bad code hosted on them, and that bad code was then being delivered downstream to those servers that were being updated. This issue has been traced back as far as March 2020. So that's the oldest date that we know that bad DLL was present in the build environment of SolarWinds. And at this time, company for FireEye, major U.S. government organizations are really among the top listed of victims at this point for having secondary attacks. And that's really why a lot of people are paying attention to this issue, because if an organization like the Treasury Department or Department of Homeland Security can be impacted by this, what does that mean for my business? Something to note as we go through these details is these investigations are still ongoing. So SolarWinds and FireEye and the US government are still conducting these investigations. They're learning new things about what these attackers have done after this malicious DLL was installed and run on victim devices. So you might see over the coming days or weeks that some of these details change, the dates might change, and just to keep an eye on the news as things progress. So how do you know if this really impacted you? So at this point, it's only known that certain versions of SolarWinds Orion network management system software was impacted with this exploited code. Now, that doesn't mean that we might find out later that other versions were impacted or other SolarWinds products were impacted, but at this point, we know at least at minimum that these versions up to 2020.2.1, hotfix 1, were impacted. And the reason I'm providing hotfix 1 is because CISA has consistently said that that version of the software they consider to be exploited. But as you're reading different news articles and blogs trying to brush up on the situation, some that's slightly disputed, but it's kind of a err on the side of caution. You're probably better off working with hotfix 2 just to make sure that you have the most up-to-date software included on your servers. Something to note here is that not every organization that has updated their Orion server in 2020, even if that compromised DLL was downloaded onto your system, and if it was run and that initial backdoor ran, doesn't mean that you'll necessarily see additional activity. So a lot of those secondary attacks for Teardrop, and there were a couple of others that FireEye was releasing that were being seen as, that they saw themselves or seeing at some of their large customers, were really considered very large, high-value targets that were of interest of this, well-resourced state-level or advanced group. But the thing that we don't know yet is since so many organizations were impacted with this backdoor due to a supply chain attack, are these threat actors going to resell that access to other groups who may be more interested in smaller businesses or non-governmental businesses to leverage additional attacks like ransomware, deploying other malware? So we're still not really sure. And ultimately, a persistent backdoor is dangerous no matter what size organization you are. So official recommendations right now from CISA and DHS and most security companies out there, including us, is if you have a server that has one of these versions of Orion on it, assume that the server is compromised. So even if there's secondary third attacks, you're not finding anything for Teardrop in that example, it doesn't mean that the bad DLL wasn't on the system. It also doesn't mean that it wasn't executed and the backdoor wasn't leveraged or that additional compromise could have occurred. So why is patching not enough? We've heard from some organizations that have said, oh, I've upgraded to hotfix 2. I'm good. I'm stepping away from this. And ultimately, that's really not sufficient to protect yourself against the Solargate, as it's being known, exploited backdoor that's coming in with the Orion updates, or was coming in. Because the patch by nature, it's really just an update. So it's overwriting those vulnerable and exploited version of the file to a newer, safe, clean version of that file. But it's not going to eradicate an attacker. So if a backdoor was run, was able to establish persistence, particularly if something else was added after that access was granted to the attacker, it's not going to necessarily expunge that, it won't expunge that attacker from your environment. What becomes really problematic here is this long compromise window. So if we think back to March 2020, if you updated at that point, you might have had this bad DLL on your systems and running with that access running since March of 2020. If you updated your system in November, you've still had that access potentially exposed since November of 2020. And that's also true if you did multiple updates in 2020. So during that whole time span, if you've had this vulnerable DLL on a system, it really opens up your organization to lateral movement risk. If an attacker did decide that they were interested in trying to steal stuff from your environment, they might have moved inwards to the environment, or they could have deployed other malware or other backdoors. There's several reports of custom Cobalt Strike beacons being associated with some of those high value targets. And Cobalt Strike's really popular with attackers right now and gets deployed in a lot of different environments, and it's very difficult to detect. The command and control traffic for this, even if you are using the most up-to-date threat feeds, a lot of the domains and IPs associated with the command and control, the C2s for both the beacon and the SUNBURST backdoor, weren't known at the time to be bad domains. Those domains also changed hosting providers a few times, which means they changed IP addresses a few times. So that alone might have been enough for that traffic to squeak through and a secondary payload to enter your environment without your knowledge. So really, ultimately, there's too many things that we still don't know. We always want to err on the side of caution when we don't know. That's the best way to really, protect your environment. We're dealing with very well-resourced, well-trained attackers, whether they're nation state or what country they're in. It doesn't necessarily matter. We know that these are sophisticated attackers. So what can I do now to make sure that your environment is secure and you follow best practices and you've done everything you possibly can do to secure your organization? So the first step, and this is a strong CISA recommendation, but it's also kind of a forensic best practice, is you're going to want to run a memory capture if possible, a clone or a forensic image or a virtual machine snapshot, some sort of capture on these devices, and maintain chain of custody according to your organization's procedures. So this is going to provide you that evidence sheet. You need to revisit it later as you're doing updates and patches and things like that. You're just going to want to make sure that you have this on hand before any changes are made. Now, the most strong recommendation and the first recommendation I definitely make is if you can rebuild your Orion server from scratch using a clean version of the operating system, definitely recommend it. If you can take those servers off the internet, take them off the internet. By the nature of these devices, they're going to already need network connectivity inbound to your organization. They shouldn't need internet access in most cases, but should they need that, or you're running live Windows updates from outside in those cases, you want to limit them to whitelisted traffic only. Now, whether you're restoring from an old image of your Orion server, doing a full rebuild and putting Orion on it, you are going to want to make sure that you upgrade to hotfix 2 and keep an eye on all of the communications coming out from SolarWinds, CISA, FireEye, all these different organizations, any vendors you work with, in case there's other versions and updates that come on if more things get discovered. So this is definitely going to be at least a few weeks while people are still gathering information on this attack. And the best practice, of course, on a critical server, especially network management that has access to a lot of devices in your network, of course, limit unused ports and services. So if you've kind of been waiting to do those projects and take a look at those servers and see what you can turn off or clean up, now is definitely a time to go through those exercises. We also recommend that you review any logs you have, whether in a SIM or it's right on the device or whatever you have handy, to look for any traffic to the known C2 domains or the IP addresses. And if you can, set up Wireshark or some other packet capture feature for your Orion servers and let that run as much as you have disk space for. So again, that's kind of from an evidentiary perspective, and to have that, it can also be used for after the fact detection should you need it and need to investigate these servers more. One of our strongest recommendations is to reset the passwords associated with the Orion servers. So that's not just every user profile that's on the box, but it's any users that are being used by the Orion services or are stored in the Orion platform. So due to the nature of this being a network management system, it might have elevated accounts associated in it or stored in it to be able to do its work in your environment. So reset those passwords, set them to 25 characters or more, make them complex, especially for your critical or elevated accounts. And really, what this entire event is kind of teaching organizations right now is to plan for other supply chain attacks, learn from this experience, and learn what your exposure looks like. So if anybody remembers the city cleaner event from a few years ago, this is much bigger scale than that, certainly. But knowing what software you have in your environment, knowing what network connections you have in your environment is always a good exercise just to prepare for when these kinds of news events occur. So how can we actually detect if this ran? So some organizations are struggling because the DLL is going to exist on almost every Orion server. And if you see that DLL with a hash that's already known as bad, you want to see if it executed. And if you see that hash and the DLL and the hash isn't necessarily known or flagged, doesn't mean that your system is clean. So there's still, again, a lot of information coming out, and that's also official guidance that not all of these have been vetted entirely yet. So a couple of ways you can come up with to look at your environment, see if you can detect if this executed and kind of get an idea of what your risk level is for the SUNBURST backdoor that's embedded in this DLL from Orion. So the first things you can do here are looking at Windows event logs. There's always great information in here. So you can check 4657 or 4568 for any service registry keys that were changed for any of your security tools, such as your antivirus. If those registry keys were changed to a value of 4, which is set for disabled, and it came from a SolarWinds process, you're probably going to want to shut down that system and rebuild it. If you need it, that would be the registry key for most services that are going to be running, and just replace the name with whatever tool you're using. Windows Defender was one of the first AV companies to actually come out with detection for this backdoor. So Defender IDs 1006 or 1007 will looking for the signature for Solarigate. It's going to be useful to tell you that you have an exploited version on your server. Some other ways you can detect this, and these are trying to get a little bit more broad to accommodate for all those unknowns, that there might be other C2s, for example, out there outside of the list of 10 or so that have been publicly released so far. So looking for any network communication at all that's originating from the DLL or a process that's loaded that DLL. Running a netstat or PCAP on your SolarWinds servers, particularly your Orion servers, and looking for anything that's rare, looks weird, is suspicious. Don't necessarily eliminate something just because you look at the IP and it's associated with Microsoft or is based in your country. For US organizations, if it's a US IP address, but it's not something that you absolutely know your server should be talking to, definitely investigate it. So some of these command and control IPs were actually hosted in Microsoft Azure. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's clean just because it's resolving to Microsoft. If you do have a tool like Sysmon or some EDRs that can detect named pipes, there was a hard-coded named pipe in there that you can look for. And if you're looking at the DLL, you can actually look at the certificate on the DLL and see what the fingerprint is of that DLL and get an idea if it was one of the ones that was suspiciously identified based on that fingerprint. Other ways that you can detect if the SUNBURST backdoor actually ran is the presence of this net setup svc.dll And I point this out because it's supposed to be in System 32, not SysWow 64. The original CISA alert just kind of provided that string to everybody, and nobody was quite sure of why it was there. But it turns out that just it's not in the right folder. So you're going to want to take a look to see if it's in there, poke around, check the hash. If you see the SolarWinds business layer host.exe writing any suspicious files like the ones with these extensions, that's something to definitely take a look at. This is not necessarily an exhaustive list, and the files that were being written, if you were the victim of an advanced attack on this, they might have like a JPEG extension, but it might not actually be a JPEG file. So you can check for extension mismatches on the device as well. FireEye has done an awesome job in disclosing countermeasures against a lot of this. And I really like what they put out for the HXIOC alert. So they have a couple in there looking for suspicious child processes of that DLL, as well as traffic patterns for SolarWinds-like URLs to look for those URI patterns talking to any domains that are not actual SolarWinds domains. So that's one way that you can do it based on, depending on your network tooling, you might be able to look for those and wildcard the domain and then actually look for the URI pattern. Something else that you can do is actually just looking for new service creation. So as this backdoor executes, it's going to install a Windows service. The event IDs, depending on the version of Windows you're dealing with, are going to be 7045 or 4697. There's also scripts out there you can run. So in PowerShell, you can just run the script on the Orion server and get all of the services back. Or I think you can actually set it to say any services installed after a certain date. And then you can manually vet those and see what else you've got in there. Probably not a bad exercise as you're spending time on this device anyway. But ultimately, if you see traffic to those known bad domains, you see one of the known bad hashes, you probably have a problem. Again, stringently recommend a rebuild, but at least a minimum of cleanup in a lot of these situations. So something else to note, though, again, absence of those IPs, those domains don't necessarily mean that the backdoor didn't execute. So just because you look in your firewall and you're not seeing the C2 domains doesn't mean that you don't have a problem. So a quick note here as well about servers left in production. So a lot of organizations, because the Orion services are so critical to managing their network and their environment, they're leaving these devices in production. We understand that sometimes that has to be done. Either you have to just leave it up partially and for a little bit of time, or you have pushback in an organization and you can't take it offline. It's doing something critical. So things you can do if for some reason you have to leave this device in production and only apply the patch is you definitely want to increase monitoring to that box. You want to turn off everything that you possibly can. Make sure that you're only whitelisting traffic if you have to leave it internet exposed. Strongly recommended that it is not internet exposed, but if you have to, you have to. Something else you can do here is actually using threat hunting techniques. So you don't necessarily need to be a threat hunter to apply those techniques. Ultimately, it's looking for stuff that looks weird and anomalous by knowing what normal noise looks like. So that's not just poking around the Orion server, seeing if anything stands out and looks suspicious, but any devices that are connected. Now, in some environments, that might be your entire network, and certainly you're going to need some tooling to be able to scale that. But if it's just a small subset of your organization or something, you might be able to actually just kind of poke around in some of those devices and see if anything looks strange. So what makes supply chain compromises so problematic and why this particular issue is getting so much attention right now? Even as a large enterprise, let alone a smaller business, smaller mid-sized business, it's really difficult to detect a supply chain compromise from one of your software vendors. A lot of organizations may even evaluate that code when they originally purchased software from a vendor, but they don't have the resources to evaluate the updates that come in every time the service is updated. Multiply that times all of the technologies that we now all own as organizations, and you would need entire teams to be able to do that for as many updates that might come out. So very, very difficult to detect this. And the downside is it really breaks that trust with the vendor. So it's hard for organizations now to feel that trust level with SolarWinds. And while they're having these devices, even though they've been around a really long time and they provide critical services for a lot of organizations, you kind of read those advisories, you want to take them with a grain of salt, and that's totally understood. And really, we're seeing widespread impact on this because attackers were able to successfully compromise one victim, albeit a large victim, and it created this ripple effect. So not only are we seeing downstream customers of SolarWinds being impacted and having to deal with this over the last couple of days, but it also introduces third and fourth party risk to your organization that's going to be very difficult to evaluate. And this is why it's so important to know who your vendors are, know what organizations you're connected to by network, and talk to them. Ask them how they're dealing with this, what is their exposure, and see if they're being impacted and what they're doing to fix the situation. So that can help limit your exposure from those other entities as this continues to expand. So a couple of things here is really, what don't we know yet? So there's, of course, I'm sure people have dozens of unanswered questions about this whole situation, but this is kind of where threat modeling can come in. So when you're dealing with a lot of unknown or untrusted variables, uh, threat modeling can help you kind of theorize what might go wrong. This is kind of good for somebody on your team who wants to sit there and think about the worst case scenarios and then come up with a plan to address those should those ever become true. It's actually a good way to do some tabletops too. So things that I know have been itching at the back of my mind are questions that I don't feel have been truly answered yet, or might not know ever or definitively now, are these attackers actually reselling this access? So just because you might be a smaller business and you are not the US Department of Treasury doesn't mean that this couldn't be an additional problem for you. Because if the more advanced, well-resourced group that was able to compromise SolarWinds and FireEye and all these places resells the access for smaller businesses and environments that they aren't really necessarily interested in, those other groups may be interested in running ransomware or stealing things. So we don't really know yet what that pattern is going to be like and what the fallout is going to be like for this compromise in the future. Something else is to think about is you own other SolarWinds products, although none of them have been officially marked as affected by this, and SolarWinds has stuck by saying that Orion was the only one that was affected. It's good to take it with a grain of salt. Consider where SolarWinds tools sit in your environment, and consider where all tools sit in your environment. It's definitely a good time to map out and look at your approved software lists and those kinds of things. The other thing that we might just keep hearing about is, as dates change, do we know that the attackers were effectively removed from the SolarWinds environment and their build environment? Is there any risk to future software? How are they going to fix this? How are they going to make sure this doesn't happen again now that they're known to be a target? So that's something we're definitely going to want to keep an eye on going forward. And as I mentioned, with the third and fourth party risk, you're going to want to know if any of your business partners have been compromised, particularly those that you might have trusted network connections with.